Hello everybody and welcome back to Be Like Christ. Let's talk about the Greek and Roman gods for a second. I always like to keep a fiction book on hand to ease my mind from my typical nonfiction reading. Every once in a while I need some heroes and adventure and imagination to fill in between the hard lines of reality. And at the moment I've been enjoying a novel that takes place 2,000 to 2,500 years ago in Greek mythology, and it loosely follows the story of the goddess Circe, the witch nymph goddess of the island of Aiaia. And it's been several years since I've read through the battles of Troy, or the stories of Odysseus, or Jason trying to get a hold of the Golden Fleece. But my return to the mythology of Alexander the Great's day has brought me some valuable perspective to bring back to the modern day when we think about the Bible. You know, we read the Bible with eyes that are full of 21st century light, and a lot of times we're so present in the present that we forget to look back through kind of the faded light of history to see what the world was like back then, and to get some perspective on where we came from, where our roots are. What's interesting is that when our sun was 2,000 years younger, it was shining down on a very different scene, on sculptures and on beautiful mosaics and temples, and on the pages of writers who were writing about gods in their stories who were very different than the God that we know today. And it was into that world that the true light of the world, Jesus, was born. After the Greeks came the Romans, and the Romans largely adopted the gods of the Greeks, and so there was some significant similarities. It's difficult for us to understand that when Jesus came and established the church, and then the church was opened to the Gentiles in Acts chapter 10, just how foreign the God that was being preached by Peter would have been to Gentile ears, yet how lovely that God would have been. This Jesus that was presented to them was very different than Zeus or Poseidon or Hermes or Dionysus or Artemis, who they would have known by their Roman names. To the Greeks and the Romans, the gods were like cogs in a giant machine, and each god played its part in making the whole thing run. Particular gods governed particular things. For example, Apollos was in charge of music and art. Hera, the wife of Zeus, was responsible for blessing marriages and new children that were born into the world. Artemis was the god of the hunt, and so if you were going out hunting, you would want to pray to Artemis or sacrifice to Artemis, or else she might warn the prey to run away from you. Hestia was the sister of Zeus, and she gave her blessings on the home and the hearth. And as we mentioned, the gods' domains were separated from each other, and so just because you offered a sacrifice to Helios, the sun god, last week, didn't necessarily mean that you were going to be protected from the waves of Poseidon's ocean this week. Courting the affections of one god didn't mean that you were going to be safe in the domain of all of them. It meant that you had to offer different sacrifices and go to a different temple and have different devotions based on the god that you wanted to please at any given moment. Another really interesting thing is that these gods were the creation of the minds of men, and even though they were imagined with extraordinary power, one thing that they couldn't escape was the vices of men, or the pitfalls, the downfalls, the bad qualities that men had. This Greek and Roman heavenly host were very far from being saintly characters in a lot of ways. In fact, many of them had major character flaws, and they often did terrible things with little to no remorse. They were unchecked by anything that was greater than themselves, and so they often cared very little for the suffering or affliction that they brought on other people, so long as they got what they wanted. If the trickster god Hermes ruined a farmer's crops by a trick gone wrong, he probably wasn't going to lose any sleep over it at night. And if the quick temper of Hera ended up destroying an entire village of people, probably wasn't even going to make the news cycle on Mount Olympus. They took what they wanted and they consumed anyone or anything in order to get it. So there was a selfish aspect to their nature, but there was also other problems. In fact, many of the gods had just insatiable sexual desires, and that often led them to do things that were evil. Zeus and the other Olympians went around from bed to bed satisfying themselves with men or with maidens to whom their marital status was irrelevant and consent was optional. And if they found that not even that could satisfy them, they weren't above going to the stables to find animals to do their business with, which is gross. Another character flaw was that these immortals were the best at holding grudges. In fact, they would often hold grudges for millennia, and those grudges would also often have devastating consequences on the mortals that came between them and the person they were arguing with. And the enemies of the gods were often very creatively and horrifically punished. They would come up with ways to kill people for their own entertainment because they themselves didn't know anything about pain. To many of the Greek gods, mortal life or human life was considered cheap or valueless or just disposable. Humans were really just their playthings, and they used them however they wanted to accomplish their ends. Humans could either be worshippers of the gods, which fed their egos and made them feel good about themselves, or vessels for sensual pleasure, or just cheap entertainment. And while there was some love that existed between the gods and humans, that love often faded as quickly as it came. The gods were fickle, and they would take their love or affection away on a whim. So imagine yourself, 2,000 years ago, that you grew up with these stories. These are the gods that you had always known. And then one day, a man comes to town. Maybe his name's Peter, maybe his name's Paul. And he's preaching, as Paul did in Acts chapter 17, about a totally different God. Paul's God is the standard of moral perfection. And he calls other people, other human beings, to join him in that holiness. He's not just some wife-stealing lowlife. This is a God who is eternally consistent in his nature and in his promises, not fickle like those other gods we talked about. Which means that when his love is given or when his promises are given, he's never going to go back on his word, or he's never going to pull his love away for no good reason. Rather than coming up with unique ways to punish other people, this is a God, Jesus, who suffered a uniquely terrible death so that criminals, sinners, wouldn't have to suffer for their sins. And the God in the New Testament is not a God who holds grudges. He's a God who offers forgiveness by the cupful, as much as could be needed for anyone who's willing to come to him and ask. He's one who places such tremendous value on human life that he himself was willing to come to the earth to die to save them. And this God is not an absent father to a host of illegitimate children like the Greek and Roman gods. But rather, this is a God who loves his children so much and places such value on them that he's just filled up to the brim with love and promises to never leave them. If you had heard about this God for the first time, out of the mouth of Paul or Peter, don't you think that would be appealing? Don't you think you would appreciate God? That he was different? You would be glad that this was a God that you had never heard of before. And this new image of the character of God that you'd be seeing is not just the contrivance of men's minds, but it's the proven fact of the life of Jesus Christ. What's great is that the true God is so much better than the gods that men have dreamed up. Men always create gods who love the things that they love and care about the things that they care about. Or else they make the things that they love and the things that they care about their gods. We tend to fashion gods in the image of ourselves. And because of that, yes, they have our good qualities, but they also have our bad qualities. Their cravings are our own cravings. And because of that, that often leads them into the same pitfalls that we fall into when we're pursuing our cravings. And so I've brought all this to your attention in this video so that you can appreciate the perspective and kind of the enlightenment that people in the first century would have had when they heard about this God for the first time. Us who have grown up with the Bible in the 21st century, especially in Western culture, America, where Christianity is very prevalent, all we've ever known is a God who is all-loving and all-powerful and all-good. And I think in a lot of ways that's caused us to take him for granted. We don't appreciate him like we should. We're not always shocked by his goodness and thankful for his consistency, touched by his purity and awed by his love, because he's become, in some ways, too familiar to us. And so let's step back in time and see through the eyes of ancient people and be overwhelmed by the greatness of God again. And so let me ask you this. How is it that we can communicate that beautiful God to people that are living with us in the 21st century? I think the way that we do that is by taking on his characteristics into our lives. We serve an all-loving, all-good, all-pure, all-benevolent, all-kind, all-consistent God. So if we want to communicate him to the world, we take on those characteristics. And so when people see us, they see somebody who is more loving than usual and more caring than usual and more consistent than most other people. And they ask us, why is it that you are this way? And that gives you an opportunity to point to the perfect example of all of those things, God. Thank you everyone for watching the channel. If you haven't subscribed, do that. We do new videos every week. I've been a little slow lately. I went to a church camp and there was no cell phone reception, so last 2 weeks I didn't upload, but now we're back on track. Thanks for sticking with us. Comment down below if you have anything to say, any other applications maybe. Maybe you're learning about the Greek gods in school, and maybe you can tie something else into this lesson as well. Let me know down below. Hit that like button, share this with your friends, and I will see you guys on the next episode. Bye.